Well, hey everybody, this is Don with the Vlog of Many Things, and this is one of my collaborations with Joe the Lawyer, Joe Block the Greyhawk Grognard, and Eric Tenker from Tenkar's Tavern. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about a question of the week, and we're going to be going live this Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, where we're going to discuss this. Now, Eric, Joe, and Joe the Lawyer have all collab their videos with me. I've watched them because I wanted to get their input, their background, that type of thing. And again, the question is kind of screaming down below on my screen, and that is D&D about storytelling? Is modern D&D ruining exploration? I think the issue is a complicated one. I really do. When you because I think you have to separate both versions of D&D. Um, Classic D&D is definitely not a storytelling game between players and the DM. Okay. Um, the dungeon master in classic old school D&D is definitely a story crafter because you have to create the theme, you have to create the adventure, and that does involve a little, for lack of a better term, storytelling, or whatever storytelling is to you. um, you have to, as a DM in old school D&D, like I said, you create the dungeon. There has to be a reason why that dungeon's there. You have to create the town and the thieves guild the player's going to interact with, and there's a backstory to that. So the dungeon master does create a basic premise for the storytelling, such as creating characters, creating story arcs, themes, dealing with emotional moments type thing. That's true. But the problem is D&D right now sits at an intersection. And it's the intersection of, I think, three primary things. And number one is storytelling, number two is exploration, and three is the player choice. Like I said, storytelling is involving creating the player characters, or creating characters, such as the NPCs the player is going to run into, or maybe the tavern owner the players interact with. A lot of this is not pre-generated. The DM's kind of doing this on the fly, but also the DM, even in old school D&D, I think has to create those character arcs along with that, plus the themes of the game, and like I said, the emotional moments of the game. How does the DM interact with players as players go through? And then you have the exploration aspect of it. And with me, I think when you look at exploration is kind of broken down into three things, and that's discovering worlds, things like dungeons and city crawling, the sewers that they get into, the mysteries that the DM kind of makes up. And I know the argument can be made that, well, the DM is storytelling because he's making up stories behind things like those cities and this, what happens when the players walk into the tavern and so on and so forth. But I think it's not a player focused storytelling type thing, and that's what modern D&D is really, really pushing. Joe the Lawyer, and I really encourage you to watch all three of my collaborators' videos. But Joe the Lawyer, in the very beginning, reads the 5e intro and really puts it into focus, where it talks about how the DM and the players interweave stories, and it's a big hand-holding adventure together. And I don't believe that's true, because I think when it comes to the players, the only thing the players are doing is players are making choices, and they're making those choices basically based upon the consequences of their actions that they're running into, the problems that they have to solve, and then the actual player agency within their character. Because what players do in D&D is they don't tell the DM a story. Now, real quick, just to clarify, some DMs will ask players to create a backstory, like give me like a one page or one two paragraph thing about your character. Now, why is the DM asking for that? Well, the DM is not interacting with storytelling with the players. What the DM is doing when he asks for a player's background or backstory is the DM is attempting to maybe cater to the character's unique aspects. Like, as an example, maybe a character in their description says that they hate goblins because goblins raided their village and killed their mom and dad and family, and so they have this innate hate of goblins. Well, as a dungeon master, I will take a look at that and I will go, oh, well, I'm going to test this player's ability to, again, how he reacts or she reacts to my consequences, and how the problems, how they solve the problems I throw at them if I involve goblins. Because that will that matters, because if a player says that their character hates goblins and they start being nice to goblins, then what is it? So as a DM, I'm going to react to that. Now, again, different editions and different tables lean very differently. And also it's by groups. Some groups run story first, they're character driven, and they like to play their campaigns like fantasy novels. I mean, again, I'm very familiar with 5e D&D. I get it, but you know what I think is happening is, I think modern D&D is really destroying the exploration aspect of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that's the big key to our videos here. And that is, you know, modern D&D is getting so much into storytelling and fable telling that it's really getting away from the characters getting out there and exploring with with their group, and worrying about what are the ramifications of my actions. um, Players do not create a story in Dungeons and Dragons. I don't even think, even in 5e, the DM should not, you know they're not creating the storyline. They're reacting to the DM. They're reacting to the DM's actions. And it used to be in D&D, we'd be tracking things like, oh, you got your torch lit. How long is your torch lit for? Um, you know, um, you know, things like that. We in old school D&D, we worry about mapping, you know, separating groups, that type of thing. How the players react. Now players get rewarded with these hyper hugely powerful characters right off the bat, and they're taking these hugely powerful characters and entering these adventures. And I don't think there's really any agency in this with players and the DMs, other than DMs are trying to turn this into like a fantasy novel. Like I said, it's this gigantic fantasy novel that they're making. And I really think it's harming D&D, because you have to have consequences to your actions. X does not always mark the spot, and the princess is not always successfully rescued. And in you know and most importantly, player characters die. Even high level player characters die. So, you know, I think when you look at old school D&D and old school play, especially, when you look at old school play, that really emphasized player choice and discovery and exploration. With, the story was emerging from the survival and the risk, and also the clever problem solving, rather than scripted plots. But I think modern D&D, everything has to be scripted out. Everything has to be pre-laid out. Everything has to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that's not D&D. Trust me, in D&D, it goes A, B, X, M, P, R, L, N, O, Z. That's how D&D should be played. And you know, it's when you look at how D&D is supposed to go. D&D is supposed to go with, and I really believe in this system. And that is, D&D is about player choices, shape the exploration, that creates the story, and then that inspires new choices. So basically what I'm saying is basically the DM will tell the players, you are facing situation X. Okay. And then those players make the choice. All right. And then that choice will shape their next bit of exploration, not a pre-scripted exploration, because they can do anything. It's like, what happens if, the players are going down the road and they run into a three-way split in the road? In modern D&D, all three ways, no matter what, will go to where the DM wants. In old school D&D, the DM has to think on the fly. Oh, they didn't go where I want them to go. I need to go ahead and make changes on the fly. So again, player choices, shape exploration, I think, and that's what creates the story, and then that inspires new choices from the players. So I don't think it's an either or. Um, I think that the game is more about players making their choices in a shared world, and then the DM reacts to that. It's not a pre-scripted in every little bit sense of the matter. And I really think, like I said, modern D&D is getting away from the exploration aspect because players have no reason to explore because it's all pre-laid out, in detail for them. And the DM is afraid almost, I think, in modern D&D to create situations that cause players to maybe die or to become separated because they don't want to keep it fun. Well, to old school play D&D, if you're really keeping to the spirit of it, that is part of the fun. I'm playing as a player character, and me and Joe the lawyer and Joe Block are playing against Eric Tenkar as the DM, and Joe Block gets separated from our group. Me and Joe the lawyer have to make a decision. Are we going to abandon Joe Block, the Greyhawk Grognard, or are me and Joe the lawyer's characters going to look for Joe and try to help Joe out and rescue Joe because it was unexpected because Joe Block tripped the trap that was set that caused the action. So yes, I think modern D&D is kind of ruining the exploration aspect of it. I think modern D&D is ruining that player choice, that player, you know, interactivity that really made AD&D, D&D, etc., so popular. So this is Don the Vlogger Many Things. Hope you liked my video. Again, down below will be links to Joe the Lawyer, Joe Block's video, and Eric Tenkar from Tenkar's Tavern. We'll be live this Sunday. Check it out, and happy adventuring, and I'll see you then.